Hey, thanks for joining me again for another episode of Understanding the Next Gen. I'm Jeff Baxter. I'm the Next Gen pastor at Mission Hills Church in Littleton, Colorado. So glad you joined me today. I want to tell you about ages of adolescence. What are the ages of adolescence? When does it start? When does it end? I mean, if you've been around for a while, you understand that something has shifted in our culture with, well, we say teenagers, but in an earlier episode, I made the distinction between teenager and adolescent. Teenager is shorter, adolescence is getting longer. Over the last several decades, we know that adolescence is getting longer. Developmentally is what I'm speaking about. They say that it starts in biology and it ends in culture. A student starts adolescence in biology and it ends in culture. What do I mean by that? Well, in biology, we can measure the beginning of puberty, particularly in a girl, based on the first start of her puberty. Now, you may not have known we were going to talk about that today, but here we are. We need to talk about it because you can measure it in a girl easier than a boy. As a matter of fact, we have governmental records of the average age of a girl's puberty and when that began. And then adolescence ends in culture because, as I've talked about in an earlier episode, the task of adolescence is individuation, to become an individual. And they do that by answering three questions: identity, autonomy, belonging. Who am I? Where do I fit? How do I make sense of all this? Do people love me for me, not based on my performance or competition, but for me? So when does it start? When does it end? Well, we're going to have some fun here. I want to tell you the ages starting in the 1900s. In the pre-1900s, the average age of a girl's puberty was 14 years old. 14. Well, when did they become an adult? Well, it was just a couple years later. It's 16. So started at 14, became an adult at 16. This is Little House on the Prairie. This is Laura hitting puberty at 14 years old and getting married at 16, 17, 18 years old. So it happened pretty quickly. Adolescence barely even existed in the pre-1900s. We didn't even have that word, adolescere, for adolescence there to explain it. Because it was like child to adult overnight, it seemed. Now fast forward with me to 1980. In 1980, I was in high school in the 1980s, and the average age of a girl's puberty was 13. Well, when do you think they became an adult, came out of adolescence? Well, somewhere around 18, 19, 20 years old. And that made a lot of sense because that's high school. About 13, 14, about 18, 19 is high school. And in the 1980s, that made a lot of sense because you would ask somebody, what are you going to do when you graduate from high school? Are you going to go to college, trade school, stay at home, get a job? What are you going to do? And most adolescents were ready to become a full-fledged adult in the mid and late 1980s. That made sense. Well, today, what do you think it is? The average age of a girl's puberty is 11 years old. 11. It's getting younger. And when do you think they come out on the other side and become a full-fledged adult? Well, the mid to late 20s. So that thing that you've been feeling with your child or that student you've been teaching or that student you've been coaching, that feeling of maybe they're not maturing as fast as they used to decades ago, you would be right. That's because it starts on average, starting the marking girls' puberty 11 years old today on average and getting through the mid to late 20s. Now listen, there are exceptions to the rule. There are 19 and 20-year-olds who are well on their way and they've individuated and they've become full-fledged adults. But that's not what's normal. What's normally happening is it's taking longer around the globe for adolescents to come out the other side and become adults. This is not just the United States of America issue. This is around the globe. As a matter of fact, in poor communities and minority communities, the age of puberty can start as low as 10 and 9. Imagine a girl hitting puberty at 9 or 10 years old in the Latino community or a poor community. And so many people ask, why is this? Why is that happening? Well, it's part nutrition, it's part family systems, it's part environment you grew up in, it's part health and less anxiety, it's a number of things, but it's getting longer around the globe. Now listen to this. This is what's really interesting, is we would say to to a high school student sometimes today. We would say, well, what are you going to do when you grow up? Or we'd say, high school was the best time of my life. And to a high schooler today who's under extreme anxiety, who's in the middle of adolescence, whose frontal lobe has not developed fully yet, that is crazy. That's crazy, because they would say, really? This is as good as it gets? Why in the world am I even here then? So we can't use that language anymore. Now think about these ages with me. We think about adolescence, and we think about, now from 11 to mid-20s is when it happens. Think about what our society has done with some ages. At age 16 years old, you can get a driver's license and be put behind this vehicle that can cause the most amount of damage at the youngest age. That's really scary, actually. Or at 18 years old, in the middle of adolescence, you can now vote. And you can go to war, you can smoke stuff, you can get a tattoo. And tattoo artists love this, because 18 years old, you can run around and say, I did it, I'm an adult now, I got my own tattoo, fearless, across your chest. That's crazy. And then adolescents can't figure out cause and effect, because they are moving from concrete thinking to abstract thinking. So now they haven't thought that through far enough. And so when they're 35 and they go, maybe I don't want fearless tattooed across my chest, then the boy goes, that probably wasn't a good idea. Or at age 21, they can drink alcohol, smoke pot in Colorado, do other stuff. 21 years old, that doesn't make a lot of sense towards the end of adolescence. Again, frontal lobe hasn't developed, can't fully think out into the future, probably make some decisions and mistakes drinking alcohol they wouldn't do otherwise. Or at age 25, Hertz Rent-A-Car has this figured out. They understand adolescence, because at age 25, developmentally it fits. You can't rent a car until you're 25 years old. And that's really frustrating for a young youth pastor trying to rent a car. But it's smart in terms of adolescence. And then how about Southwest Airlines? This is crazy. One child 14 days old to 2 years can ride by themselves with a 12-year-old on a plane. 14 days old to 2 years can ride with a 12-year-old on a plane. I don't think they thought that one through. The newer research now is showing, this is really fascinating, that a girl who reports a really close relationship with her father starts puberty 6 months later than a girl who would report that they don't have a close relationship with their dad. In other words, when there's a healthy relationship with a dad, it delays the beginning of puberty for a girl, shortening the length of adolescence. There's something about family dynamics and family systems that creates health in the life of an adolescent growing up. So it's getting younger and younger, contributing because of nutrition and environmental factors and all sorts of things. But I've done the math. I've figured it out, that by the year 2034, girls are going to be born pregnant. I'm just kidding. Not really. But it is crazy. This is terrifying. How young adolescence is getting to start and how later it's getting to come out of it. And I know some men in their 40s like me are probably still in the middle of it, still trying to figure this thing out. Just keeps going on and on and on. But listen, today's 23-year-old is the developmentally equivalent to a 17-year-old 30 years ago. Let me say that again. Today's 23-year-old is developmentally equivalent to a 17-year-old 30 years ago. Adolescence is not God's intended purpose. It's a social construct of modernity. But society is full of adults who have caused this to happen. We don't want to hear that. We don't want to take responsibility for the lack of maturity and growth that's happening that is out of our control, but it's adults who have put these things and these pressures and competition and performance on kids that's causing them to slow this process down. Let me give you an action step. Now that you know that adolescence starts when it does and ends when it does, 11 to mid-20s, what difference does that make in understanding kids you care for? Well, what's difficult about that? I'm sure you have a long list. But what's also exciting about that? Make a list about that too. And how can we help them appropriately grow towards maturity as an adult? Not to speed it up for them, They need to walk through this process of identity, autonomy, and belonging. But what can we do to come alongside of them? Hey, thanks for joining me again for Understanding